Hello, my name's Jeff Young, and I'm an e-spec author, and today's story is a steampunk story. And this is part of the Kassandra Leyden adventures, and this is Kassandra Leyden adventure number 2. Kassandra has realized by now that she's different from everyone else, and she has the ability to speak to the dead, but she doesn't really understand how to use that ability yet. So her father creates an apprenticeship for her with one of the mediums that is local in the area. And this is how she learns to speak to the dead. This is called Beyond the Familiar. The departed have better things to do than talk to you. Kassandra met that statement from Madame Foss with a canted eyebrow. Look at me like that all you want, girl, but it is still the truth. The old medium tipped her teacup back and drank down the last dregs as Kassandra waited for her to continue. It may sound absurd, but the dead don't always have an interest in the price of butter. They have moved on. They've joined the grand choir. They've earned their reward. They have other concerns. Kassandra couldn't help but notice as Madame Foss delivered her last comment, her eyes drifted off to the right, and she lifted the cup for another sip, only to find she'd already emptied it. Kassandra enjoyed her time with her new mentor, surrounded by the scents of old book leather and candle wax, which made her feel at home. However, she often found that Madame Foss avoided was as important as what she relayed. Cassandra's father was the one who'd set up this apprenticeship, rather to her amazement. He told her that despite whatever he felt, it appeared she was taking after her mother's spiritual prowess, that the least he could do was introduce her to someone who could keep her safe. Because it was expected of her, she asked, "Well, Madame Foss, how does one engage with the departed? My former teacher had rather poor taste in robbing graves and then forced the spirits to speak." Madame Foss's dark, wrinkled visage puckered up even further, as if she'd been offered something scraped off the road outside. "You and I will be avoiding such wrongdoing. Whatever we do is like a tool. We could build a house with it or lash about and do all sorts of damage. And such behavior has the potential not only of hurting others, but also of yourself." And with that, one of her brown fingers shot out and dug into Cassandra's chest. "You will do better than that, wretch." Leaning away, seemingly so she could reach for her tea while conveniently putting herself out of range of that finger, Kassandra considered her mentor. Madame Foss kept her hand outstretched for a moment longer, and then settled back into her chair. "We speak to the dead through intermediaries. There are those that are as restless in death as they were in life. They can find the spirits we need to speak to, and if those are unwilling to speak, the intermediaries can carry messages." "They're familiars," Cassandra said, suddenly pleased with herself at the realization. The chair creaked as Madame Foss lunged forward once again, finger pointed, and then thought better of the action. She clutched her hands together, staring at Cassandra. "I keep forgetting how much older than most of the ones who were brought to me you are." She shook her head, the gray curls swaying under her bonnet. "You like to think yourself of listening like a youngster would. Girl, if you say familiar to anyone else, they'll be crying witchcraft in no time at all. What we do has nothing to do with the darkness that we were discussing before. Perhaps some spirits do become familiar, and perhaps that's why they take such a name. But the common man knows the term only as evil. We speak to intermediaries, and to intermediaries only. We are mediums. The dead speak to us, and we speak for them. That's all that matters. And when someone decides they know better than we do, that's when the words evil and witch get tossed about. And that's when they start getting tender." She considered Cassandra for a moment longer, her dark eyes squinting as though she could see inside of her charge. And then the passage of a dirigible droning by overhead broke her focus. She stood up suddenly and gestured for Cassandra to follow her. Setting aside her teacup, Cassandra brushed the front of her brown dress down and then stepped after her mentor as she crossed the sitting room and walked through the foyer. A large staircase rose into the dimness of the upper level, dividing the house. Past it were a pair of large wooden doors. Cassandra had spent most of her time in the sitting room and the kitchen during her visits. They hadn't ventured beyond that until now. Madame Foss pulled out a large brass key and unlocked the doors, and then threw them wide. Dark curtains covered the windows in what appeared to be a converted dining room. Wooden chairs with caned bottoms had been spread around the perimeter, and a rich rug covered the floor. But what drew Cassandra's attention was the table at the center. It was circular and draped in deep velvet. A wooden disc lay on top, only slightly smaller in diameter, and at its center was a hole through which were braided copper wires rising from the inside to latch onto a Jacob's ladder that climbed halfway to the ceiling. Copper threads chased around the wooden circle in strange patterns, and two brass hand grips were mounted close enough for easy use. A leather-backed chair was pushed up to the table in front of the grips. Madame Voss pulled back the chair and said to Cassandra, "Sit." Before they'd been merely conversing, and the tone that the medium took now was one that Cassandra dropped immediately into the chair before her without even considering rebelling. Instinctively, she reached for the grips. They were cold to her touch, that she almost pulled away, but a sharp glance from Madame Voss made her keep her hands in place. The older woman reached down and turned a large crank that was just visible under the edge of the tablecloth, and as she did so, a crackle snapped through the air, and a flicker of static flew up the Jacob's ladder, and then another, until visible arcs ascended upward and dissipated into the surrounding air. The copper wiring on the table danced with fat blue sparks under the current, until it hit Cassandra, shooting her hair out in all directions. Her red curls unfurled like a corona about her. "Now you know why I wear a bonnet," came Madame Voss's dry comment. But Cassandra scarcely paid any attention at all to the comment. Her skin, her pores, her mouth, her eyes, her ears, every exit from her wept thin, translucent streams. Not water, ectoplasm. Madame Voss had called it the insulation between the worlds at one point. And there it was, real as real could be, right before Cassandra. Gradually, the silvery substance collected into a sphere over the table, and when Cassandra looked down at the design in copper with its circles about the hand grips, she realized that it was designed to help keep the ectoplasm contained. The Jacob's ladder overhead blew off just the right amount of static to keep the circuit she completed safe. More and more ectoplasm poured from her until the sphere swelled to twice the size of her head. She looked at it closely and discovered that it was spinning, ever so slightly. And instinctively, she lunged forward out of the chair and, without a thought to Madame Voss's concerns, plunged her head into the silver mass. At first, she didn't notice anything. It was almost as if her eyes were adjusting to a dark room. She definitely wasn't sitting at the table any longer. But there came a faint sound that might actually be footsteps, and a light breeze blew across her face. And gradually, she realized she was looking down what she could only describe as a path. It was so straight and long that perspective vanished into distance. She could see a little of what looked like woods to either side, but couldn't actually move her point of view. It was as if her head wasn't with her any longer, only her eyes. There were shapes and shadows ahead of her. However, they were so far down the path they were more like suggestions or imperfections in the overall pattern. And then one of the shadows stepped off to the side and grew darker and became more defined. It stepped onto the path and crossed it quickly. Briefly, it hesitated. For the tiniest part of an instant, Cassandra had the impression of a dark, cloaked form turning to stare at her before it faded into the other side. The last time Cassandra had seen the shade of her mother, Anastasia, she'd worn a dark cloak, and if there was any spirit she wished to speak to now, it was certainly her. If Mother were to become her familiar spirit, her intermediary, it would be almost perfect. But the figure was gone, and the path faded as Madame Voss's iron grip pulled her forcibly back into the chair and thus the mortal realm. As Cassandra sat there gasping, her hands torn from the brass grips, Madame Voss considered her, hands akimbo. "Should have known you were going to do that. And from now on, you headstrong girl, you listen to me. You plan on staying on. The other side doesn't take kindly to intruders. There are things that keep us out. That's the important part. We talk to the other side. You don't get to visit unless you are planning on staying. Now you just sit back and I'll get you another cup of tea. Your heart's going to race and be all out of rhythm for a while, and it's likely you'll have trouble catching your breath. You're young, so you'll do fine, but it'll hurt." And with that, she reached underneath and pulled the handle she'd cranked into place against the underside of the table. And as the apparatus threw out a few spray sparks, she patted Cassandra on the shoulder and wandered off after tea. While Cassandra sat there, blinking, black spots chased across her vision as her heart thumped away like a swallow trapped in a chimney. She knew she would have a few moments to herself before Madame Foss fiddled away with the new auto brewer that she had bought to make her tea, and her mind was racing. Cassandra had seen what she could dare say was heaven. Well, she'd seen the other side anyway. It wasn't anything like what she'd expected. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra continued to take a carriage across town from her father's home to call on Madame Foss. Their relationship, however, had definitely changed. In short, Cassandra's task was to observe everything. And while she hadn't been invited to sit at the table again, she found herself introduced as Madame Foss's assistant and was called upon to help the medium with her clientele. She took coats, made tea, and seated herself demurely behind Madame Foss while the woman asked questions of the departed. She noted that Madame Foss did the talking. The strange apparitions which appeared over the table had no voices. It didn't take her long to realize that Madame Foss was in fact reading the lips of her spirit guests. Cassandra soon began to learn the art herself. One morning, she'd stolen into the sitting room to discover that her mentor had been looking at during their initial meeting. The bookshelf across from where she'd sat had a conspicuously empty spot, and reaching into the void, she found a small daguerreotype image. In the scratchy image was a small ebony-faced child with deep brows and a long nose, who held a cicada in their hands. The likeness reminded her of Madame Foss, and the black curly hair could easily have turned gray. Cassandra carefully replaced the picture, brushing the dust back into place. 2 days later, while Madame Foss was cursing at her auto brewer, Cassandra slipped into the table room. She noticed that all of the chairs in the working room, as Madame Foss called it, were attached to the floor. Various knickknacks were affixed to surfaces that they rested upon. She felt the odd lightness produced by opening the way with ectoplasm and imagined things might become chaotic if not controlled. She'd taken an unsupervised moment to examine the table further and found the name Emmett Ressex engraved on the wooden panel where the crank fitted in. Cassandra had heard of his reputation as a spiritualist and an artificer. And after watching several sessions, it became obvious to Cassandra that when she'd sat at the table the first time, she'd merely begun the process of contacting the other side. Once Madame Foss had the requisite amount of ectoplasm collected, she would call out seeking an intermediary. Someone she often referred to as Jasper would answer her. A caricature of a vaguely familiar face would then form in the surface of the ectoplasmic sphere. His answers were given by the motion of his lips without evidence of any sound. Madame Foss's intermediary appeared well informed. After a short wait, he told an elderly man that his wife had sold off her jewels before she passed away and where she hid the money. Another was informed that the property line that he believed was incorrectly drawn was actually accurate. However, there was no way to prove it. A loved one was assured that their lost child was happy. A woman in black was told that her husband was in fact not dead but had run away. Cassandra found herself admiring Madame Foss's ability to deal with all of these pronouncements. As far as Cassandra could tell, Madame Foss hadn't lied to any of them. She hadn't made them all happy either, but in the end they had all paid her. Cassandra watched them as they left and noticed something different about each one. Something was lighter in their step. There was an absence of tension in their expressions, or less of a slump in their shoulders. In each case, the person who passed beyond or had run off left their supplicant with a need for closure, and Madame Foss had given them that. It didn't matter whether or not they left in a carriage, steam-powered auto, or simply walked. Each left as though a weight was lifted from them. It occurred to Cassandra that this ability was one that she admired. As much as she watched and learned, it wasn't enough. She desperately wanted to call for the ectoplasm once again and seek out the dark-cloaked figure that she'd seen in the way between the worlds of the living and the dead. And the recurring image in her imagination made her want to try something reckless, and only Madame Foss had shown herself to be very observant, and Cassandra was certain she would know if her student had used the table.